Hello and welcome to PIHOA Network, where we break down Africa's story and dig into the challenges and opportunities that shape its future. Today, we're exploring a critical topic that affects every single one of us: Africa's growing dependence on commodities. Over the last few decades, this dependence has driven both economic booms and devastating downturns, all because of something called the commodities supercycle. Join us as we dive into how this cycle works and understand its impact on African economies today and the years to come. Before we begin, I want us to understand exactly what a commodity supercycle is. This is simply a period where commodities experience consistent price increase or a decrease in a significant and sustained way lasting more than 5 years, and in some cases, decades. This is what happens with prices of things like oil, copper, and crops over many years. They go up and down depending on what the world needs. So, how is this relevant to Africa? Well, Africa's recent economic growth is closely tied to the commodities supercycle, a recurring global phenomenon that began in 1996 and reached its peak in 2011. During this period, countries like Brazil, India, Russia, and especially China needed its raw materials to industrialize and grow their cities and factories. Therefore, commodities such as oil, copper, and agricultural goods saw their demand increase, which led to price hikes, significantly boosting many African nations. Mineral-rich countries such as Angola, Nigeria, and Zambia saw rapid expansions and in some cases experiencing up to 7% GDP growth rate per year. But as the saying goes, what goes up must come down. The commodities supercycle is not a smooth ride. It has its peaks and lows. Lasting until about 2011, things started to change. China, the engine behind much of the demand, started restructuring its economy to focus more on consumer-driven growth rather than infrastructure. This shift meant less demand for African raw materials like copper and oil, crashing the economic boom and devastating Africa's progress. Just before the decline in 2011, oil was selling for as high as $115 a barrel. Countries like Nigeria and Angola, which depended on oil for most of their income, were making a lot of money. But by 2016, oil prices had plummeted to around $30 a barrel. The effects were devastating. Nigeria, for instance, saw a sharp contraction in its economy, with GDP growth falling from 6.3% in 2014 to just 2.7% in 2015, and then slipping into a recession in 2016. Angola's fate, on the other hand, was much worse. Its GDP growth dropped from 5.2% in 2013 to a negative growth by 2016. Just picture that. Every day, you're depending on a big paycheck, then suddenly, that paycheck is cut in half, or even worse. It's not just governments that suffered. When prices drop, jobs disappear, food gets more expensive, and ordinary people are the ones left to feel the impact the most. This was a reality for many people in places such as Nigeria and Angola. It's important to acknowledge that these cycles don't just happen in isolation. A lot of it depends on what's going on in the rest of the world. For example, when the Arab Spring happened in the early 2010s, oil prices spiked because of instability in North Africa and the Middle East. But not long after, the United States found new ways to produce oil at home for what's called the shale revolution, increasing global supply and therefore bringing oil prices down. Then came COVID-19. It shook up the global economy and hit Africa hard. In April 2020, oil prices briefly went negative, meaning that oil companies were actually paying people to take oil because they couldn't store it anymore. Countries like Angola and Nigeria that relied heavily on oil saw their incomes disappear almost overnight. As expected, this led to budget deficits, job losses, and increased poverty. Of course, different commodities don't always follow the same cycle. For example, while oil prices were crashing in 2011, some agricultural products were still doing much better. During this period, West Africa's cocoa export didn't suffer as much. Additionally, During the 2007 and 2008 commodity supercycle, we saw prices for oil, base metals, and agricultural produce all rise together. This was unusual as different commodities typically experienced price fluctuations based on different global demands. But when COVID-19 hit, almost all commodity prices fell, demonstrating how vulnerable Africa's economy is when it depends too much on one thing. To understand the significance of this, you have to put this into perspective. Think of a farmer who grows only one crop. If that crop fails, the farmer is left with nothing else to sell. But if the farmer grows a variety of crops, they can survive even when one crop doesn't do well. Why? Because they have options. The global economy works in a similar way, and Africa must be ready to diversify in order to withstand market strains. Here's where it gets tricky. Instead of moving away from this dependence, many African countries are even more dependent on commodities now than ever before. A report in 2019 from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development highlighted a worrying trend. Africa's dependence on commodities has increased and not decreased. In fact, 9 out of 10 sub-Saharan countries are now considered commodity dependent. This means that at least 60% of their export revenues comes from just a handful of natural resources. To add to that, back in 2009, only 82 countries worldwide were classified as commodity dependent. By 2019, that number had risen to 102, with African countries making up a significant portion of it. While other regions have diversified, Africa's reliance on raw materials like oil, copper, and agricultural products has deepened, making our economies more vulnerable to the whims of global markets. In Nigeria alone, over 85% of its export earnings come from oil. Subsequently, that figure is much higher in Angola. Africa's reliance on commodities is a double-edged sword because, as bad as it can be on the downturns, its minerals and resources still remains one of its biggest strengths, and it should not shy away from its benefits, especially because a new commodity supercycle may be on its way, and this one could be much bigger. Some are calling it the green commodity supercycle. According to S&P Global, the push across G20 nations to shift away from fossil fuels to adopt cleaner energy and a net zero economy could create a huge surge in demand for certain materials. Just like in the past, commodity supercycles are powered by the world's hunger for raw materials. But this time, the demand will be for materials needed to build renewable energy technologies like solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles. And Africa is the key to making this all happen. This is because copper, an essential metal for all things electric, is expected to see a 53% jump in demand, reaching 39 million metric tons by 2040. Other battery metals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel will also experience an increased demand. And here's where Africa comes in. Regions in Central Africa, especially like the Democratic Republic of Congo, have some of the world's largest deposits of these key metals, meaning that Africa could benefit massively from this upcoming green commodities supercycle. Regardless of this, the key to Africa's future and independence is diversification. It simply cannot afford to remain stuck in this cycle of boom and bust. Lessons must be learned from the past to capitalize on the future. Instead of relying on commodities, Africa needs to develop other industries by building factories, promoting technology, and investing in education. Some countries are already doing this. Rwanda, for example, is investing in technology and tourism, and additionally, Ethiopia has been building up its manufacturing sector, making everything from textiles to machinery. These are good steps, but more African countries need to follow on this path. Africa is not just a continent of resources. It carries ideas, culture, and people, and together we can build a better future for everyone. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Africa's dependence on commodities. If this message resonates with you and you believe in the potential of Africa, share this video and let us keep the conversation going. Don't forget to like and subscribe to PIHOA Network for more insights that matter as we continue to explore Africa's path to a brighter future. As usual, see you guys on the next one.